Okay, welcome to our second podcast on AI with Hassan Abba and Fuad Mughal. In our first podcast, we reflected on how far are we from artificial general intelligence, AGI, where we developed a model of three barriers to go from specialized AI to general AI.
So, following that initial podcast, we approached someone who actually knew what they were talking about to see what they thought about our thoughts and the model that we derived. And so we approached someone called Professor J. Mark Bishop, who is the professor of cognitive computing at Goldsmiths, and he came back with some pointers around the three barriers model that we developed, and gave us some helpful insights into his own understanding, and also gave us some further sort of direction to go and look at. So if you want to go into the next slide, and we'll run through the pointers that he came up with.
Exactly. Thanks, Fuad. So I guess the first major pointer that he comes up with is that, look, even though Chomsky cites consciousness as a key hard problem, in fact, David Chalmers is the most cited person around this, because that's his field that he works in. So one of the changes we made is to swap Chomsky for Chalmers. But apart from that, that barrier number 3 is pretty much spot on with the Chinese room experiment we discussed. The hard problem of consciousness, but what we've also added in this model is the dances with Pixies argument that Bishop makes in his paper, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this podcast.
So just to recap, then, what you're saying is that the points that were made by Chomsky were still relevant.
Absolutely.
However, we're attributing that to Chalmers, who was more associated with that idea of the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the dances with Pixies argument that Bishop makes in his paper is that if computer-controlled robots experiences a conscious sensation as it interacts with the world, then an infutable of consciousness must be present in all objects throughout the universe. Now, since this is absurd, then machines can never be conscious. Now, I think, Fuad, you and I, we were discussing, for example, where Bishop was talking about his cup of tea as an example.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, because he was effectively saying that by I have a handy prop here, by that argument that says that my cup of tea here has consciousness, has some level of consciousness. So if a robot has consciousness, or if a automaton or machine learning, or whatever you want to call it, has consciousness, then by extrapolation, then this cup of tea will have consciousness.
Yeah.
Which, as you say, is leads to a bit of an absurdity.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, the background to this whole idea of different objects, whether they are biological objects such as us, or inanimate objects having consciousness, is not a new thing. In fact, I've just learned recently through looking at Professor Bishop's lectures and so on about panpsychism, right? It's a philosophical theory asserting a plurality of separate and distinct psychic beings or minds that constitute reality. In fact, Leibniz, a typical panpsychist, suggested that the world is composed of atoms of energy that are psychic, right? Which he called monads, right? These monads have different levels of consciousness, and Leibniz said that, look, in organic reality, those monads are sleeping, and in animals they are dreaming, and in human beings they are waking. But God is the fully conscious monad. So it's not a new thing when people are trying to extrapolate that, look, that even inanimate objects like computer chips, join enough of them together, they will develop some level of consciousness. And I think it's coming from that panpsychism philosophical theory, which Professor Bishop just says, look, it's really absurd and doesn't make sense, and we'll cite his paper towards the end.
Okay.
The second suggestion that Professor Bishop made was around complex systems, right? I think the 3 points we made about biological neurons are different from computer neural networks. The second was about abstract models of neurons. Now, there are models of neurons like the Hodgkin-Huxley equations that model neurons, but these are still abstraction and they simplify factors. They are not a very accurate model of how biological neurons work, right? So the brain is still a complex dynamic system.
But are we saying that we're getting closer to modeling a single neuron than we were previously?
I think there's still quite a few hurdles to be made. I think what we have is we have a patchwork of models, and it's a bit like, in my mind, it's a bit like moving from alchemy to chemistry, right? There is no unifying theory or framework that makes you make that leap, right? And we are essentially, as far as neuroscience is concerned and computing is concerned and so on, in this AI field, I believe we are still in the sort of alchemy phase, and we cannot make those leaps into the sort of chemistry phase because of some of these barriers that we're talking about.
But in essence, what you're saying though is that where neurons are being modeled, they're being modeled for specific purposes as well.
Exactly.
They're not being modeled for generalized use as it was. They're being modeled to potentially do a particular task, which is where another barrier comes in, which is around the limitation of specific models versus generalized application. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. I think the third point, which is a really interesting point, because in some sense, what John is saying is that, look, that red line, which goes from barrier 2 to barrier 3, he's saying you're making an assumption that the arguments against AGI are wrong. So, i.e., the complex systems arguments, the complexity of the human brain, the consciousness arguments, all those arguments, if they are wrong, then you can make the red line linkage.
But are you not simply saying that in some optimistic future where potentially barrier 1 and barrier 2 are overcome, there is still a barrier 3 to overcome? So the red line can only really be achieved, as you say, as you move beyond barrier 1 and barrier 2. But I think, to his point, it does make that assumption that the arguments against AGI are incorrect at that point, in order for barrier 3 to be reached. But again, this is a fairly optimistic view that you'd be able to overcome barriers 1 and 2 in order to get to 3.
Exactly. So in essence, Fuad, I think the model pretty much stands. I think we are on the right track based on our limited learning. I mean, this is an area we're still learning about. To really grasp, look, what are the barriers in moving from specialized AI, which is where we are, and it's that sort of green line. We're talking about the GPT-3, the GPT-4, all the kind of vision type of AI that's going on. These are all kind of curve fitting type of AI, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So we are still in that space. We haven't moved beyond barrier 1 at this point. Whilst there have been some attempts at looking at things within barrier 2 and some modelization, as it were, of barrier 3 without any real breakthroughs, we are still, as you say, within that first paradigm of barrier 1. So is there what's the additional reading that people can look at them for to delve deeper into this?
So I would suggest, I think it's probably, I mean, there's quite a few books and reading that we will put into the description of the podcast, but I would suggest The Idea of the Brain, right? A History by Matthew Cobb is probably a good start. And there's sort of two key points really coming out of here, if you read into it. One is our understanding of human brain and neurons is limited and patchy. And this goes back to the barrier 2 that we were discussing earlier on, and the complexity.
Are we talking, sorry to cut across you, but are we talking understanding in terms of biology or understanding in terms of consciousness, and the link between potentially those two paradigms?
I think it's both.
Right.
I think even our biological understanding of the brain is quite limited at the moment, right? And patchy as well. So I think those are some of the things that he talks about in his books in terms of where we are in that. I think the other key point that he also makes in his book is about how since the 50s, we proposed computing as a sort of a thinking machine, right? And that became a metaphor that we've been stuck with. But a lot of thinkers are saying that probably that metaphor needs to be replaced, but we don't know what it would be replaced by, right? And this comes back to our lack of understanding about how the brain works. Hence, we cannot construct a model or an abstract view apart from what we already have today. So we're still using the computing paradigm as a sort of metaphor for how the brain works, but a lot of people are saying potentially that could be taking us down the wrong path as well in how we are envisioning things.
So the basic abstract positions that you want for so the basic abstract positions that have been used to describe computing, you're saying have sort of almost been too romantic in their view of the fact that it is some kind of mini brain, when in reality it for want of a better expression, is just a large computer. It's just a large calculator.
Exactly.
And therefore we need to shift that metaphor into something that's more appropriate for computers, such that as computing develops, it eventually is going to go into the direction that, as it will do, as opposed to up at the top, which is the brain. It's going to go into something which we know is achievable through that process.
Exactly, and I believe what I think is that potentially, because of that metaphor or the limitations of that metaphor, we're probably still in that green line, right? Because if we stay with that metaphor, then essentially what we're doing is we're just doing patterns in data. We're trying to fit the curve. That's what we're trying to do, and we're getting better and better at it. But we are not moving into the complexity barrier and even the consciousness barrier, because we don't have the constructs or the models to move into those areas at the moment.
Okay.
I think, let me just also bring out, it's probably worth reading Professor Bishop's paper, Artificial Intelligence is Stupid and Casual Reasoning Will Not Fix It. I think there are sort of three key points.
He's not sitting on the fence there, is he?
He's not, he's being direct. And I think, look, what he's basically saying is that, look, everything that we're doing, all the impressive AI that we're seeing today doesn't bring out genuine understanding. Those systems don't understand what they're doing. And I think we sort of brought that out with the Chinese room experiment as an example, right? That genuine understanding is the key thing that needs to be built into these systems, right? Because with genuine understanding, then you can then move relevant knowledge from one domain to the other. Hence the reason why they call specialized AI, because they are very specialized in their specific domain. They could not move out of their areas or domains, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, so that makes sense. So effectively what you're summarizing there is the fact that without understanding, how can you take that that leap of using past experience and past knowledge to new scenarios and new situations and being able to apply them appropriately? And that's where genuine understanding or consciousness, as we referred to it earlier, really comes in.
Exactly, and I think it's that key thing that differentiates humans from machines, right? Because humans can very quickly adapt to complex and chaotic situations.
Yes, and we've developed, I suppose, heuristics to allow us to shortcut certain things. We take in small amounts of information and make judgments or creative leaps and say that, well, I saw something similar to this in the past, therefore it must be this. It may not be this, but that's our inherent biases as well. That's what we have built in to us through previous experience. Whereas machines won't have that. Machines will take the inputs potentially as provided and compute the same output as they would have done with those same inputs. But it's the gaps in inputs and, to your point, the chaotic nature of the inputs that separates humans from the machines at this point.
Exactly. Okay. So I think, to sort of round off, what we've done is we've put together a set of references that you can look into to learn more about this space. And I think we are both on a sort of learning journey as well. Every podcast is a new thing for us. It's such a big area. And we're just sort of scratching the surface.
All right. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.